Hello, 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 ladies and gents, and welcome to this week's episode of the Bought and Beloved podcast. As always, it's me, your girl, Kirby Kelly, and I have a really incredible guest with me today. We're just gonna jump into it. His name is Ike Miller. I keep wanting to say Mike Iller. It's Ike Miller, and his book is called Good Baggage: How Your Difficult Childhood Prepared You for Healthy Relationships. I read this book, and literally, like, you know how Paul wrote letters to the church, and it was like, this is to this church, but we all read it? That's how I felt about this book. I'm like, this was written for me, to me, but everybody else can read it. Like, that's literally what it felt like. Spoke to my soul, spoke exactly to the inner wounded child in me who grew up with a dysfunctional family, who is now navigating life as an adult and cultivating healthier, biblical, better relationships. And this is the book I wish I had growing up, and especially as a young adult. So now it's available to all of you. And we have the amazing pleasure of having Ike Miller himself joining us here on the podcast. Ike, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here, Kirby. Thanks so much for having me on, and excited to dive into this conversation with you.
Absolutely. We're just going to hop on in.
Yeah.
But real quick, actually, for those of my audience who's watching and listening who don't know you, can you just fill us in a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, so my wife, Sharon, and I lead Bright City Church here in Durham, North Carolina. We planted about 5 years ago, and so not something we ever intended to do or had any hopes of doing. It's one of those things that God calls you to, and you're like, are you sure? Like, maybe there's something else, and you kind of explore everything else, and God's like, no, seriously. And so that led us to planting a church, and we have 3 kids, 11, 8, and 5, 2 boys and then a girl. And so that keeps us very busy all the time, nonstop. But that's kind of a lot of what we do. And then kind of through the last few years, I just found myself more and more gravitating towards this conversation around dysfunctional families, my own story of growing up in that, and then also my journey of healing, and not only healing, but finding things that actually I could use for the good of my relationships. And so that's kind of what drove me to this book and writing all of this. So I'm so excited to hear that you felt like it connected deeply with you. And that means a lot, because that's really what I wanted, is what I hoped for, is that in me sharing my story, others would feel like seen by it, but also, gosh, this is speaking some stuff that I really needed to hear. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah. I mean, it put a lot of language to things that I felt. And I popped out the womb and started going to counseling. Like, my family had a lot going on.
Yeah.
So even just like the language that the book had and the voice that you have, it just makes it approachable and not like a dooming conversation. Because I think for a lot of people, when it comes to talking about childhood trauma and wounds and dysfunction and coping mechanisms and how we even struggle today, because we haven't addressed the things that happened back there 10 years ago, 20 years ago, however long ago. It's a very inviting book. And the foreword is by Jefferson Bethke, who I love, good friend of mine, him and Alyssa. Yeah. So once I saw that, I was like, oh, I definitely need to read this book. Like, if he's in on this, then I know it's going to be good.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to even first just start by unpacking a little bit about your background and your story, because that is what you pulled from to be able to write this book and provide reference and practicals for people who are going through maybe not the same thing, but at least have wounds, point blank period. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so my story is, I grew up in a home where my father had what we would call an alcohol use disorder, is sort of the clinical name for it. It's been called alcoholism. Being an alcoholic, different generations have kind of different terms, and even just kind of our knowledge of these kinds of disorders has changed over time. And so, but he had that, and that kind of wreaked havoc in our relationships, in our family. It led to my parents' divorce ultimately. And so just lots of different ways in which that dysfunction rippled out into really all of our family relationships. relationships and continue to affect our relationships. But that was sort of the environment that I grew up in. At times was very chaotic. My father could be abusive at times, which is not something I honestly really acknowledged until the last few years. I think when I thought of abuse, I thought of sort of the worst case scenarios of, kids going to school with bruises, or it was like an everyday kind of thing. And that wasn't true for me. So I just assumed, well, it's harsh, but it's not abuse. And as I started talking about that and sharing about that and kind of hearing from other people saying, no, that was abuse. Like that was not okay. I came to understand and appreciate kind of the level of that I experienced as well. And so my parents were separated for a lot of my growing up years and then ultimately divorced when I was a senior in high school. And so that's kind of the environment that I came up in and what I experienced. But yeah, with the book too, I also wanted to be clear, this was not just for people who grew up with an alcoholic parent. I mean, there's all kinds of dysfunction that we experience. And there's even dysfunction that is not due to anyone's misbehavior or, disorder. A number of people that I talked to shared that they grew up in a context where they had a sibling who was really sick. And so a lot of their parents' attention was on that sick sibling, which makes sense. Like that is not them doing something wrong, but that still affects us as kids, And so recognizing this plays out in all kinds of different ways.
Well, I think also what made me relate to this book so much is I grew up in a very similar environment where my father was an alcoholic growing up, and that caused the divorce of my parents and was detrimental to my brother and I growing up, just like seeing like two sides to the same person almost. Oh, yeah. And then he ended up passing away from his alcoholism when I was 10 years old. And that triggered my mom to become an alcoholic. And so it's like I literally just did an interview with someone about codependency and talked about that. So I'm kind of repeating myself here for those of you who listened to that episode. But it was like I jumped from one ship to the same ship, but now it was like even rockier, especially as I was still a child, but like it was just different. It was different going from, growing up as like a young child in this environment to then growing up in high school in this environment. It was so difficult. And I came to the faith when I was like 14 years old. And so navigating that as a believer as well was really hard too, like adding in that worldview and like learning about the faith and making sense of like honoring your parents and like addressing sin in my life. It all just came to the surface, and I was like, how do I deal with this?
What do I do with all of this?
Exactly. Like it's so much. So I kind of want to talk about, like why is it that children, like, and maybe you relate to this. I mean, you probably do. You wrote about it in the book. But I know for me as a young child, I felt very responsible. Like I wasn't the oldest sibling. My oldest brother has autism. And so I felt like a lot of the I need to protect my family fell onto me at like 3 or 4 years old. It's like, how did I even come to that conclusion as a young child? And I know you address how there are young children who grow up into adult children who assume almost like I need to be savior of my family. I need to be responsible. I need to take care of these people, only for it to be dysfunctional for them as adults going into adult relationships. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot of different pieces to that. But one of the things that helped me make the most sense of this was understanding that on the one hand, one of the things that gave us a sense of security in the midst of those situations was to have some level of control over our environment, even if it was very much not the reality. Like we didn't actually have control over it, but for us to exert ourselves to try to take action gave us some sense of control in what felt like an uncontrollable environment. And so some of it was simply that level of, I need security, and the best way that I know how to get that is to exercise some kind of control or to have an illusion of control. The other side to this though, and this was one of the things that was just so fascinating to me as I did research, is to understand with a child's brain, they don't have the ability to distinguish really the context of these kinds of situations. And so, for example, when a parent does something, the child lives with almost this kind of omnipotence, meaning that when I do something and someone responds in a certain way, I essentially have complete control over this situation. We can't take into effect that they've consumed alcohol or that they've had a rough day or a bad day. We just say, I did this and they did that. And so I assume that I have this level of control and that their action is directly related to my behavior. And so that's where we begin to develop this mentality of like, well, if I asked for something this way and I got this awful reaction from my parent who may be intoxicated, I assume the problem was how I asked the question. And so next time I just need to ask the question in a better way. And so next time we ask the question and it's the same question, we maybe change one word, but because they're either at a point of intoxication where they're in a good mood or they are just in a different headspace, they respond much better. And instead of us being aware of those changes in them, we assume it's with how we ask the question. And so we become caught up in how do we just ask things the right way, do things the exact right way to ensure certain outcomes because it gives us some level of security. And so I think that's a little bit of why we do that as kids. And then that kind of teaches us to operate that way in every relationship we go into. So then as adults, we kind of walk into a relationship and we say, okay, the outcome of this conversation entirely depends on how I start the conversation or how I ask the question. And so we agonize over how do I say this the right way so that they respond to me with, joy and happiness versus anger. We try to control our environments. If I can just make this event go perfectly, then everybody will be happy with me. If I can just manage how everybody feels about this family get together, then everything will be okay. We have that sense. Even if it's not the reality of control, it gives us the illusion of control.
It almost just makes me think like, okay, I just need to either find a reason or create a reason to make it make sense. Like as a child, it's like you don't fully know the dynamics and even the trauma that they have that caused them to do the things that they do. Like as adults, I think you begin to humanize, like in this case, your parents more, or even just like community more, like whoever it is in your life that has fed into the dysfunction that shaped you. It's like you begin to humanize it more. And I think that's where we see a lot of the healing take place is because we're at that capacity now as individuals who have more autonomy and understanding and maturity. But I totally relate to that where it's like as the child, it was like, I need to fix myself in order to mediate the situation, whatever the situation was, whether it was like dad's an angry drunk or mom's a crying drunk. Like, I need to fix whatever is going on and maintain the peace. Like if other people were over, I almost felt like I had this responsibility of like, I need to keep this hidden and I need to make sure that like everything's okay. And it reminds me so much of the garden. And I know you talk about this later on in your book in like chapter 7, 8, or 9 or something. I actually have it underlined, the quote. I have it right here. Where you wrote, I forget which chapter this is, but it's the cycle of sabotaging our relationships. And you wrote, when we were children, deception was a fort we had to build to protect ourselves. But now it's become a prison. We're trapped in dishonesty as an outgrowing coping skill, but we also don't know how to stop. And for me, it was like hiding, and this is so biblical, breeds about so much shame. And so there was like so much shame and so much blame that was cultivated in me as a child that as an adult, I'm now having to like unlearn and wrestle with, not just within like the dynamics that I share this way, like horizontally, but even vertically with like my own relationship with God when it comes to my own shortcomings. And it's just so interesting how like very early on, those things affect us that permeate and bleed into our relationship with God. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that or speak to that.
It's interesting. I think one of the things that has been true of my life, and you saying that just brings this to the fore all the more. But I think because of the environment that I grew up in and the environment that you grew up in, because we weren't sure what was okay to share and what needed to be hidden, our default was to hide everything.
Yes.
Or we felt like even if we weren't the ones who were perpetuating this. We weren't the alcoholic, the one who was embarrassing us. We still felt the shame of it. And so now as an adult, we don't really know what we should feel ashamed of and what we shouldn't. And so we just feel ashamed of everything.
Yes.
Right. And so with God, then we're like, I don't know if this is okay or not. Like, should I be ashamed in God's presence or not? But I'm just going to default to being ashamed. And the way that just compounds the impact of those things versus there's times where, like, even with Sharon, I will be reluctant to say something because I'm like, this is going to be so embarrassing, or I'm going to be so ashamed, or this is going to feel exposing. And I say it and she's like, why did you hesitate to say that? Like, that's not a huge deal. And I'm like, well, to me, it felt like the end of the world. So.
Yeah. 100%. And it makes me think of sorry, I have like a million.
No, go for it.
So.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just like read your book and it really impacted my life. But it makes me think of, right. It makes me think even of like the survival roles. Cause you mentioned 4 survival roles, and I'll let you maybe explain that more.
Yeah.
But there were 2 that really stuck out to me and like that I identified. I know for me, I identified with like the caretaker, overachiever, hero, and the pleaser, clown, mascot.
Yeah.
Where it's like, as I read both of those, I was like, oh, I see a lot of both of these in me, where it's like I feel this need to take care of other people and to overachieve and to like, I need to be in control, which I didn't even see it as that. But the more I grew up, I was like, wait, I'm actually trying to be in control of this situation. And even with like the pleaser, clown, mascot, just like, especially where it says like we struggle with setting and keeping boundaries, expressing anger, and stating our needs because we fear people like will be unappealing to people. It's almost like that rejection wound. And so I think even as a child, again, going back to being a child of God, like this bleeds into our relationship with our Father, where it's like we even wrestle in our faith in this way when it's like those dynamics come to play with God, where it's like, well, I'm afraid to be my full self and to bring my sin to you, or God, I got this, like I'm in control. Can you maybe explain what even if you want to just go into the other 2 roles, there's 4 of them, and how that affects us or protects us as children later to hinder us as adults, and even in our relationship dynamics and our relationship with God dynamic. Can you break that down?
Yeah. So the 4 different roles are sort of the hero, the one who just felt this pressure to make everything okay. We took responsibility for everything. There was the mascot that you mentioned, sort of the one that is like, this is the one who brings pride to the family because we do everything so well. We are the star athlete. We are the smartest kid. Like, we get all of the recognition. And so we try to sort of redeem our family's reputation through our like reputation. Then there's the sort of the kid that disappears, that we are safest when we just disappear. You don't even know, like, it is just best if nobody knows I'm here. That's how we feel safe. And so we just kind of disappear. And then the last one is kind of the acting out. And so this is the child who is kind of like, you know what? It doesn't matter what I do. It's not going to make it better. And so at the very least, I'm going to get attention by acting out, or I am going to make sure that everybody else feels responsible and they feel this need to take care of me, because at the end of the day, this is because everybody else's junk is not together. And so those would be kind of the 4 different responses or roles that we play in our childhood context. But when they play out in our relationship with God, then it's really interesting to think through how they play out. And so when we look at our situation before God and we think about sort of this hero role, we kind of feel this need to just always get it right. Like that we wear righteousness like a badge. It is like, I never mess up. I always get it right. And so the way that works against us is the fact that we are broken humans and we're not always going to get it right. And so when we don't get it right, we beat ourselves up. We blame ourselves. We get so down on ourselves because we were supposed to get it right. Then you've got the sort of the mascot. And so for us, religion is very much a performance. That doesn't mean we always get it right, but the outward appearance is we've got it right. And so we can feel this inauthenticity in ourselves because we know who we are inside of the costume, but who everybody else needs to see is sort of the costume, the mask, the image that we're putting on. And so there's this distance between us and God, but it's the distance between who we really are and the self that we're projecting, not necessarily sort of between the self that's projected in God. To everybody else's eyes, what we look like is, man, we are close. We are tight with God, right? The sort of disappearing kid is this sense of like, it's safest if I'm just not seen. So in my relationship with God, like, yeah, we may not be close, but he's not upset with me. We may not be close, but he's not like, throwing stuff my way that is really hard. It's just safe if it's just like, I'm quiet, he's quiet, we keep our distance, that's safe. And then the acting out is kind of the mentality of like, you know what? It doesn't matter what I do. Life is going to be hard. God is going to do what God's going to do. And sometimes that means God does some stuff that I don't think is okay. Or we blame God for a lot of things that are not necessarily God's fault. Or we assume like, well, if things are getting better, it's because God's going to fix it. And so I'm just going to sit and wait for God to fix it. And so I think it plays out in a lot of different ways, but those are some kind of initial ways that I think we see those play out in our relationship with God.
I've also noticed, I've noticed this in myself in certain seasons, and I've noticed this in people that I know in my life, even to this day, where when it comes to like the childhood trauma and the difficulties and the dysfunction for whatever that looks like, I know so many people who want to be free from that or want to grow and heal and mature and to, I mean, your whole book, the banner of it is redemption. I see that all throughout your book. And I know people want redemption, but they either, one, don't know what to do, don't know what those first steps are for remedying what has been done to them or the environment they were in or what they engaged in, whatever that is. Yeah. And I've also seen there are people who just sit in their trauma and that's their comfort zone. That's where they get like the validation for everything that they're feeling and experiencing. And as much as they want to be free from that or say they want to, they're not taking those steps to actually work and heal through that. Yeah. So I kind of just want to know your thoughts on that for the person who's like either sitting in that place and they're comfortable in that place, but really that's harming them and the people around them. What would you say to that person? Yeah. And also the person who's like, I'm not sitting here, I'm stuck here and I want to get out of it. What would you say to that person as well?
Yeah, so I think that, and it happens for different reasons, but I think some of us reach a point where our identity is our trauma. So we this is who I am, is what happened to me. And so what keeps us there, or the reason that we don't take those steps, is because we don't know who we are apart from that trauma and can't imagine ourselves apart from it. We don't know how to have validation apart from people being able to kind of console us when we experience, and it's not always intentional. I don't think we sit here kind of like, let me talk about my trauma in a way that gains people's attention. And yet that's how it functions in our life. And eventually over time, that becomes sort of a pattern for us, not for everybody. But we find ourselves doing that because that's how we know to get validation and to experience some level of comfort. And so we've made trauma our identity. Now, I want to be very careful there to say, again, it's not something we willingly do, that we want to do, but for some of us, it's what happens as we sort of don't know what else to do. For those that are stuck there, I think there's a couple of things to do. I think one is it can be really hard to find a good counselor. I think maybe we go to one counselor or two counselors and it doesn't feel like the right fit. And so we kind of step back and say, well, that's just not the answer. And I want to encourage those folks to keep looking. That can be a hard part of the process, is to continue looking. But maybe if you're not ready to take that step, the step that I encourage everyone to take is to just begin paying attention to your pain, and beginning to name the pain in your life. Because a lot of times what's at the surface is the sort of evidence of what's going on deeper down. And until we can deal with what's deeper down, we're not going to deal with what's on the surface. And so for me, for example, one of the places where this began was just really I struggled when people criticized me. I struggled with criticism, or when people disagreed with me and it made me feel like they were upset with me. And so I kind of started digging down a few layers. And ultimately what I got to was understanding that the reason that was so hard is because my identity and my value was wrapped up in how other people felt about me. Meaning, I could really only feel good about myself if I knew others felt good about me. And so what I needed to work on was not like, how do I get people to agree with me more? What I needed to work on was, where do I need to find my value? Where does that really come from? And so we only really get to those things by paying attention to our pain. So I would encourage people to start by journaling, writing down, like, here's some areas where I consistently experience pain, and begin to notice the patterns, because usually they come from similar sources or similar sort of relational dynamics. And so begin to catalog those and then say, what are some common themes in these? Is it boil down to how people feel about me? Does it come down to conflict? Does it boil down to I feel incompetent? Like, what is the thing that this boils down to, so that we can begin addressing that? And then we can kind of get these kind of weeds up by the root, so to speak.
And even because you mentioned counseling, if you are watching the podcast on the YouTube channel, down below, I have a link to this one Christian, like biblically based counseling called Faithful Counseling. And it's all done on your phone or on like online, and it's a whole network of Christian counselors. And I have a discount code so you can save money on your first month, and it's affordable on top of that. So I just want y'all to know that that's a resource that I myself use, and just want to put that out there for anybody else who needs that extra help, that extra guidance, that extra counsel to put words and verbiage and even just like the methodology to healing with what you're going through. So I want to put that out there. And I want to talk about like even the emotional aspect of this, because your book says how your difficult childhood prepared you for healthy relationships. And I think a big part of that is like, okay, if I'm stepping into a healthy relationship, I know for me, like with my husband, coming from the background I came from, I brought in a lot of baggage. He brought in baggage. Like, that's just what people do. Like, we bring that in and we work through it. And I know for me, a lot of that was, I need to actually understand my emotions and what I'm feeling, why I'm responding the way I'm responding to certain situations or words, or, I mean, like everything you said, I completely relate to that. So what does emotional baggage often look like in our lives, and how can we go from I am carrying so much emotional baggage to I'm walking out my relationships healthy in the spiritual sense, in the emotional sense, in the like relational sense? Like, I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So one, just to begin, when we speak about baggage, I think a definition that's been really helpful for me is understanding that baggage is coping mechanisms that we developed in one relationship, a dysfunctional relationship of some sort, that we then carry into another relationship that does not need those coping mechanisms. Wow. And so that is where it begins to infect or, cause harm in those relationships, is because we're bringing stuff to that relationship that doesn't need. So for example, you come out of, and this doesn't just happen with childhood relationships. This could be, you're in a dating relationship and there's unhealthy dynamics and this person is unfaithful, for example, or they're cheating a lot. That creates this insecurity in you, and your coping mechanism is to consistently be asking for reaffirmation that we are okay, that the relationship's okay, that we haven't done anything that has led you to be with somebody else, or whatever it may be. And so our coping mechanism is to consistently be asking for confirmation, affirmation that things are okay. Well, you take that into a healthy relationship then, and you're always asking like, are we okay? Is everything okay? And they're like, we're fine. Like, it's okay. Chill out. Yeah. But it's a healthy relationship, and it doesn't need that kind of relational pattern. That's how baggage begins to affect us negatively. And so what I want to say with this book, what I'm talking about is at some point, that coping mechanism served a purpose. It actually worked to protect us in some way. And so we first just need to acknowledge the work that our younger self did to protect us and to care for us. And instead of shaming our younger selves for developing these things, acknowledge, man, they did some hard work as a young child to protect us. Mm-hmm. But then to be able to say, but even if it operates in negative ways, what's the strength? What's the thing that was in that I can still use for my relationships now? So, for example, one of those that I really kind of discovered, especially as Sharon helped to call this out in me, was my ability to read people. And how, as a child growing up with an alcoholic father, you walk into a room and you're assessing, like, what's the emotional climate of this room? Is it safe to be here? Is he happy? Is he sad? Is he angry? Do I need to get out of here? Is it safe? And so you develop a powerful ability to read emotions before you're even aware of it, right?
Yeah.
And so now as an adult, you take that into every room you go in and you're like reading the emotional climate of the room. How's everybody feeling? Is somebody upset with me? Do I need to fix something? And the way that works against us is we assume we're responsible for everybody's emotions in the room. We just assume like, they gave me a bad look, I must have done something wrong, right? When in reality, it may have nothing to do with me. And so if we can take that step to say, okay, I can see that they're upset with me, and I can see that they're upset, but not necessarily draw the conclusion that they're upset with me, that gives us an incredible ability to be empathetic. And so the distinction I make there is between reading emotions and reading minds. If we can stop at just reading emotions and not go to the place of reading minds, we can use that for the health of our relationships now. And so with emotion and the emotion piece of this that's so hard is that some of these things develop in us as children before we even have language. I mean, we are developing, and it's complicated by the fact that our emotional part of our brain is nonverbal. And so what happens a lot of times as adults is we find ourselves in a situation, we react very strongly to that situation, and then we try to give word to it. We try to give explanation to it. Because it's not as if I experienced something and then I thought, I should react this way to this because I think this, and then react. It's no, this happened, I overreacted or I reacted in a really strong way, but now I need to explain why, or I need to justify it. And oftentimes the reason we think on the surface is not the actual reason, because that is just us trying to give language to something that's already happened. And so to be able to step back and say, okay, no, why did I really react that way? Because it wasn't really appropriate based on what they did or what they said to respond at the level that I did. But there's something in me that triggered that level of response. And so I need to do that investigative work in myself to be able to name what exactly was going on. And so that was a part of my process too, was being able to realize, okay, there's times that I'm reacting to things that I don't think are about this situation. I think they're about something else, and really being able to then tie that back to maybe something that happened in my childhood or ways that I was formed by my family of origin.
I think something that really helped me too, especially when it comes to just like the emotional side of it, I felt like for me as a young person, and with everything that we've talked about, knowing like where I was and you relating to that too, every time I felt something, it's almost as if I like put it in a closet and I was like, I can't acknowledge this. I need to acknowledge this situation, make everything good, make everything right, whatever. Yeah. Until the point where like it just like came toppling out to the point where I was like, I don't even know what I feel. What is this emotion? Yes. So I would respond in certain ways and then would look at that and internalize it and shame myself. And it was just this cycle of like, it affecting every relationship because of this one, like you said, that happened at the very beginning, that baggage got brought into that was never unpacked and like ironed out and hung up. Like, it was just like just stuffed in the closet and we'll never address it or whatever. Yeah. And I think for me, what you said, like understanding where that emotion relates to in our experience and where that first got brought up. But I think even another way when it comes to assessing our emotions is, okay, what am I feeling? And then grounding that in, okay, well, what is true? Like, what is truth? And does this emotion line up with what is truth? Not only in the situation, but even biblically. Yeah. Because like whether it's I feel angry and it's like, well, I shouldn't feel angry. It's like, well, no, you can feel angry, but do not sin. Like, what is the truth? Or, a friend or a roommate acts a certain way, but like they didn't put away the dishes. But every time you didn't put away the dishes, your parents like scolded you or lashed out at you. And it's like you have this certain mindset and response, but it's like, okay, well, what's true about this situation and about this person, about this worldview and about relationships biblically? It's like there's so much to unpack, but I think a good first step is, okay, with how I'm behaving in my relationships and responding emotionally, where did that first stem from and how have I been conditioned because of that environment? But two, what am I thinking and feeling now, and how can I take inventory of biblically what is true? I think that can be even just like our first steps along with counseling and doing all the hard work. Those are two practical things we can do. Yeah. But as we wrap up the podcast, are there any more, is there any like one bit advice or any more practicals or any truth or a specific audience you want to speak to that you just want to commission people with as we wrap up our conversation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that can get in the way of us experiencing redemption around these things is we can get caught up in the question of why did this happen to me? And we need an answer to that before we can move on. And so my encouragement to you is to recognize that that not everything happens because God wants to one day use this bad thing that he caused to do something good. I think it's really important that we know that there are things that happen to us because of the outworking of someone else's sin. That's purely what is going on, or that they had broken desires, or that there was something of just the brokenness of our creation that works against us. But at the end of the day, there's just going to be times where we don't know why these things happened. And so being able to move from that place of, I need to know why it happened, to move to a place of, well, whether it was God bringing this in or someone's sin working against me, God can still use that. God still wants to use that. That's what redemption looks like, is regardless of what the cause was or what happened to us, God can still take those broken pieces, that pain, and use it. And so encouraging people to move from that place of, why did this happen, to what can God do with this now? That's been a huge part of my own healing and journey, is accepting, I don't know why, fully my dad was an alcoholic. I know some of what he experienced as a child. I know how that led to things. But what I do have voice in, what I can speak to, what I can learn is what God wants to do with that now. How can I use this to bring healing to his kingdom? And so just encouraging your audience just to say, okay, God, I know what I've been through, but I also want to know what do you want to do with this? How do you want to use this so that we can bring healing and really fight back against the work of the evil one in the ways that he wants to use our pain to exacerbate pain? Let's reverse those cycles. Let's work against that.
Amen, Ike. That's so good. And I completely agree, y'all. I mean, first of all, get this man's book. It's linked down below. It's so good. Again, it's called Good Baggage, How Your Difficult Childhood Prepared You for Healthy Relationships. And that's the hope, is that through doing the hard work, reading a book like this, talking to a counselor, taking inventory of your life and your dynamics right now, what has been done to you and what you walked through, you can use that to actually cultivate healthy relationships moving forward. It's beautiful. God can redeem all things. He can redeem your relationships. He can redeem your past. He can redeem your hurt. He can redeem even your present day addictions that could be hurting and harming others. So I thank you, Ike, for going first and sharing your story and being bold and being brave and doing the research and pouring your heart into this book for people like me and for many, many other people who are like the both of us that are going through all kinds of different dynamics in the world. But I know your book is available today. Y'all can get it right here, right now. But for those who want to maybe check up on everything that you're doing and follow along, even you personally in your ministry, where can people check you out? Do you have a website? I know you're a pastor of a church. I'm assuming you have social media and everything.
Yeah. So IkeMiller.com is my website. You can find out more about the book. I've got a podcast, a mini-series podcast that I've done around topics related to good baggage, just to kind of introduce people to the conversation so people can check that out. I'm on social media at Ike F. Miller, Instagram, X, I guess they're calling it now, all that stuff. And then our church is brightcitychurch.com. And so if you're in the Durham area, we'd love to have you. But you can also check out messages and stuff there if you want. So that's where you can find me.
Come on. Well, thank you for joining me, Ike. And thank you to everybody who tuned in, whether you are watching the videos that drop on Tuesdays on YouTube, or if you're just listening to the audios that drop on Wednesdays. I'm so glad you tuned in. I pray that this blessed you and encourages you. And until I see you guys next week, I love you and keep on going. Keep on growing. I love y'all. Bye.